Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Centric. This being a show where I talk about TV shows that are crime dramas. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Only Murders in the Building, Season 3, Episode 7. Great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. So I really like picking up in the aftermath of last episode. We are kind of seeing our three heroes as they're kind of going down their respective paths, and ultimately how those paths kind of led them back together in some capacities and not in others. So I just thought that was kind of a really interesting thing, especially when we're, let's start off with Charles, where he's just kind of assuming like, right, we're all going to make up, it's going to be fine, because he's not really like the whole, he's also an awkward human being, so it's like him kind of apologizing because he's like, I'm not in the right, I'm not in the wrong, so they'll be the ones that kind of apologize and come crawling back to me, but it never happened. And I love how that ties into Uma's story, which we find out she's a klepto, but her reasoning for being a klepto is actually really, I'm sure there's a reasoning by anything that a person has, like whether it's like some disorder or whatever it may be, it stems from something, some trauma. In her case, she takes stuff because it's like, right, people go and people disappear and they leave you. So how do you hold on to them? It's that thing of even when people are going there with us forever, she has a more physical representation of that. She takes stuff and she keeps reminders of people. That way they're never completely gone. They're always with her in some shape or form. But she talked about the fact that her and Bunny often had falling outs where it's just like, and we get so pissed at each other, but we didn't completely forget why we were pissed in the first place and we make up. It's like, yeah, that is funny how life works sometimes. Sometimes if you're lucky enough, it works in that way. And sadly, other times it's like people go their entire lives piss at each other for the smallest things and never made it. She's even glad, like, I'm glad when Bunny died, she actually wasn't like dead to me. And that, right, people are either dead to you, gone, or like actually dead. And it's like, luckily Bunny and her were on good terms before Bunny died. So it's like, right, glad we were friends and she wasn't dead to me at that point in time. Like other times she would have been dead to me. So it is kind of sad that does interfere with a lot of people, that sometimes you never know what's knocking around the corner. And even, Charles was like, but they're not dead. But it's like, yeah, but you don't want to go the rest of your life sitting on something that everyone has their own piece of the fault of just why it fell apart. It isn't just on one person. It's just an amalgamation of just many different things is the reason why our crew kind of fell apart. It's all been building and building towards that. So Charles is having to deal with that. I think because he's so focused on that, he's not really focusing too much on his loneliness. He doesn't even focus on the fish anymore or too much on Joy, because at least he had Oliver and Mabel, but now it's like, oh, you're back to being completely alone. At least he was heartbroken and he had his buffer, but it's that thing of you get so wrapped up in your own sadness, you don't realize what you got until it's gone, right? So it's like, right, I took them for granted. Like, I've been so alone for such a long time since his breakup, since Lucy not being in his life. Obviously, that's prior to her coming back into his life and everything, but it is a thing of, he had gotten used to that solitude, and Mabel and Oliver changed that. And it's just, right, he could focus on the joy of it all, of like losing her. But like I said, he got drowned in it because he took Oliver and Mabel being in his life for granted. So, and that obviously ties into Oliver's story, where it's just like, right, they're trying to find a replacement for Charles, and it's kind of a no-go in any capacity. So until Cliff calls in someone, which I love that his mom is like, honey, I hate it when you do that stress dancing. I love that. It's like, oh, how he deals with his stresses that he dances. But they called in Matthew Broderick, which took me back. I was like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. I was like, that's actually pretty awesome. But then I even started thinking about it too. I was like, well, obviously Nathan Lane's been in this show, and I was trying to think to myself, I was like, Lion King, obviously, Nathan Lane being Timon and Matthew Broderick being older Simba, but I was like, they definitely worked together, because I was like, didn't they do? I know there was a Mousetrap movie. I think it was. Didn't they do that? Because the producers come up later on, but I was like, because the moment the producers were mentioned, I was like, is that the movie I'm thinking of? But I'm like, no, that came out like later. Like they were, I feel stupid, but I could have sworn there was like a Mousetrap movie, like live action, that they were in like many, many, many years ago. Because I know, like, wasn't the producers like in the early 2000s? Or was that like a lot more recent than I think it is? I don't remember. But I feel so like they probably worked together multiple times throughout the years. I mean, probably not even just on camera, but probably like, maybe on stage as well. But maybe I'm not well versed in Matthew Broderick or Nathan Lane's like Broadway or theatrical, like outside of like just like film and stuff. Like I don't know like any of their theatrical theater work. I'd assume Nathan Lane's a theater actor. I could be mistaken. Anyway, tangents and all that aside, but him showing up and being the replacement for Charles, and him and Charles having history, because Charles is like, well, this isn't the first role he's stolen from me. And it's like, Charles, you wouldn't have been right for Ferris Bueller, you were 41. I thought that was like, is that supposed to be a mean-spirited joke? Looked into it because Matthew Broderick and Steve Martin are like roughly 17 years apart in age. I was like, wait, it's not that big of a gap. And it was like, for one, I didn't realize how old Matthew Broderick was when he got Ferris Bueller. Like he was like 24-ish when it came out. So he probably was like 22, 23 when they filmed it maybe. So he would have been 41 like Steve Martin would have been 41 around that time. And I was like, interesting. I didn't realize. I actually, because I had no idea how old Steve Martin is. I was actually surprised to be like, oh, he's 78. I had no idea. But I just thought that was just interesting. For one, I was like, I like that Matthew Broderick just showed up in the show as himself. Because you never know when you see someone in the show whether they're just a celebrity going to be playing themselves or not. So it's just funny. And I love that he's such a method actor that it gets on Oliver's nerves, because it's like, oh, he wanted to run the number 38 times. It's like, oh yeah, but where does this constable come from? It's like, oh, the same area as you. He's like, oh, so he's from like New York or Manhattan specifically? He's like, oh, that changes everything. Let's run it again. And it just got on Oliver's nerves. I even love to the point he had to call Mel Brooks. It's like, okay, you work with Matthew on the producers. I mean, which I never seen it once. He's like, really? It ran for so long and you never saw it. He's just like, I was kind of going through some stuff at the time. I kind of had some stuff of my own, but he's like, wait, did you tell him he could do whatever he wants to, that you're kind of okay with co-signing any like liberties he wants to take, or just kind of deep diving into this as much as he wants? Oliver's like, well, and Mel Brooks is like, oh, you fucked up, Oliver. I love that. That's amazing. I wonder if they've had to have worked together at some point in time, right? Mel Brooks and like Martin Short. Once again, we're talking about a lot of, I think, legends in the industry, and I'm not the film dude. I'm not the cinema dude. I'm not the theater dude in regards of like Broadway and theater. Like, I'm not that dude. I'm not well versed enough to know. I have my little pocket of like slight cinema knowledge, and I probably know a little more television knowledge, but even then it's like above average television knowledge. So that's where I'll kind of like put that. So I'm like, so I don't know all the connective tissues of just like, they probably had to have worked together at some point in time. We're talking about some pretty big names in this conversation. Like not even just Martin Short and Matthew Broderick. I throw Steve Martin in that regard, but you get what I'm trying to say, right? But I just love that, that was just kind of a nice cameo. I was like, that's dope. But yeah, it was just too much for Oliver. I mean, understand, like, it's also meant to play into like the whole like, oh yeah, that's the thing about method actors, that it's so much. I mean, you hear that all the time about like, oh, someone getting so method into it that is like, you're like, kind of made the production kind of a nightmare. Not going to name any names, but you hear those stories from time to time about people who go like, oh, you're not a method actor, you're just an asshole. It's like, I don't know if this is one of those instances or not, but I love that he was just so like, no, I'm like really into this. I was like, you got to admire that spirit, but it was just too much for Oliver. And it's like, right, you might be better than Charles in this and that way, but at the very least, Charles makes it fun. And and the moment he had an opportunity where Charles was like, right, I'm sorry, he's just like, hey, oh, all's forgiven, buddy. He's like, no, I don't want to be back in the play. And he's like, oh, don't worry about it. It's like, I need Matthew out of this as much as possible. So yes, you are back in the show regardless of how you really feel about it. He's like, I just want to hang out with you more. He's like, oh, we can hang out all the time, like 8 nights a week. I mean, yeah, 8 times a week when we're doing this play and stuff like that, or just because it's just, I need to get rid of Matthew really quickly. And I even love while they're having a conversation, Matthew Broderick's still standing there. You even see him a couple times adjust his glasses, and it's like, you're still here. He's like, well, I can be like amendable, and it's like, oh, like, yeah, you gotta feel bad for him, And it's like, oh, Oliver, you would have been a better like Ferris Bueller than him. And it's like, you really mean that? He's like, Oliver's like, I'm trying to mean it, but come on, he's perfect. It's like, it is one of those things of like, I'm so curious, like, in real life, I've never actually looked into it. You always hear about, oh, what actors actually went out for a role and either passed on or just sadly just didn't get it. Like the whole, obviously the one that I hear from time to time is like, Will Smith passed on The Matrix, apparently. It's stuff like that where you're just like, man, what would that have been like, you know? But it's like, I'm curious, like, who else would have gotten the Ferris Bueller role? Like, who else tried out for it? Like, are there other people that maybe they're actors we've never really heard of because sadly they never got the opportunity? Or are they other actors that, like, oh, they found other opportunities that maybe they are a well-known actor now that maybe, you never know, just stuff comes into your life. Maybe at the right time. Sadly, sometimes it does. I don't know. Just it's an interesting thing to think about. That I've just never really. It's one of those roles where I'm like, I wonder who else would have gotten. Because it's like, obviously, it's the movie we got, and it's become a classic that you're like, yeah, you couldn't imagine anyone else in that role because it's so synonymous with him. It's like like I said, it's become such a classic. It's hard to imagine anyone else in that role. So that's why I'm so curious, like who else was up for that? Maybe either way. I do like the rekindling of the flame between, and even Oliver calling Charles his best friend. I was like, oh, that's actually really adorable. Because Uma and Charles had that conversation earlier about like, because Charles was trying to make it seem like, oh, Uma's like, for whatever reason, he's so delusional he refuses to recognize himself as old because he's like, oh yeah, like people your age, you lose friends all the time, and she had to throw it back in his face. It's like, yeah, people your age, you might not want to take granted the friends that you have. Because later on he was like, oh, like a millennial thing that kind of gets thrown your way and you don't understand it, or like Oliver making some offhand remark, and Uma's like, yeah, that sounds like god awful, but he was like, yeah, he's like, right, I thought that at one point in time, but once it's out of your life, this thing that you've become accustomed to for 2 seasons, you kind of miss it, and he misses his besties, so I thought that was dope. I even love that Oliver and Charles had decided, like, right, we'll give Loretta's book, the thing with all the stuff about Ben, to her as the clue to kind of figure out. Or we could just, actually just kind of, like, muster up the courage to say sorry. And it's like, right, let's give her the clue first, and if that doesn't work, then we kind of, like, fall to our knees and beg and plead for her to take us back. Because they had the conversation where Oliver revealed why he was getting rid of the fucking pig message written on the mirror. And even Charles is like, yeah, but it's, it's like, wow, it seems wild, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Loretta it's not definitive evidence that she's the killer. But it's also like, you're not really the best, person to kind of say that, considering it's like, well, Joy was kind of a suspect for a tiny bit, even though, like, we as the audience kind of knew she wouldn't be, like, wasn't the killer, but it's still like, right, she was a suspect for a little bit. Plus the whole Joan thing. That's always going to hang over Charles' head. And that's going to be one of the biggest things that people will forever hold against him. It's the whole Jones situation. But either way, all the while that's happening, we have Mabel and Theo hanging out, which I'm like, hey, we got more Theo. That's dope. Him and Mabel hanging out. Them hanging out this episode really clicked as a situation, especially with the whole her and Talbot thing, that I'm like, that seems like that could turn into a complicated love triangle. I mean, I don't know if Theo views her that way or not. It probably is just like a thing of like, no, you're just a friend. Like, obviously Talbot likes her, but also like Mabel's, once again, past relationships haven't worked out for the past 2 seasons, so I'm curious. Once again, I don't think it's going to work out for any of them. Like, maybe Joy and Charles can find their way back to each other, but I don't think the Oliver and Loretta thing is going to work out for whatever the circumstances may be. Like, I don't think she's the killer, but I think it's like she's going to get a role and she's probably going to move away, or maybe they just go their separate ways for whatever reason. But I don't think that's going to go beyond this season, sadly. So, well, we'll see. So they might all 3 kind of walk away, sadly, alone, but kind of still having each other by the end of the season. We'll have to wait and see. But it is kind of, once again, nice that, and weirdly enough, like, everyone has someone. Our trio, despite split up, like, Charles had his interactions with Uma this episode, and Oliver had, well, Cliff and his mom, but also Matthew Broderick, which obviously became too much for him. But even God, Mabel, because I had to stop myself because I kept wanting to say Selena. It's like I hate when I do that sometimes where I'm just like wanted to say the actor's name instead of like the character's name. But yeah, like Mabel had not only Theo this episode, she also had Talbert. So, but Theo being a CoBro is really interesting. I love him being like, oh, it's not just an action movie about snakes. It's also like, you know, it's about shedding kind of your image of like who. It's about shedding your skin and kind of shedding this, like, shedding yourself from what people kind of make you out. Society's, like, view of you and stuff like that. But it's also an action movie about snakes and stuff like that, you know? But I love the whole bit where it's just like, oh, like, because luckily she has Theo as a hardcore fan that, like, she's talking to Dickie trying to get some information out of him, and she has to look to him, and he's like, oh, which one's your favorite? She's like, the second one. And it's like, yeah, he's like, that second one sadly doesn't hold up, and she's like, yeah, and she looks at Theo, and it's like, because of the Jamaican accent. He's like, no, because of the special effects. And Theo had this look. I was like, is that supposed to be like a little like, it looked like that was supposed to be this tiny joke of, I don't think that was a mistranslation on Mabel's part. I think he legitimately was like, no, from a current standpoint, the biggest issue with that movie would be the Jamaican accent is kind of very like, yikes. But it's like, I think it's supposed to speak volumes that Dickie doesn't see it as an issue. It's like, no. The biggest issue is like the special effects. Like the Jamaican accent thing was fine. It's like, and like I said, you see that look on Theo's face like, no, that's not the major issue why that movie's a problem now. It would be problematic nowadays. I think that's funny because and that's also the thing of like movies, like should they be held under the same scrutiny of present day when they are every movie is a time capsule of it was written a very specific way. I think it's important to keep like books and things like that. You don't have to agree with them. The point is like, okay, it's a time capsule of like, this is written this way because that's the story is set in a very specific time. It was written in a very specific time. So we should, and it's a reminder of just also how much we've grown as a society of like, hey, we don't think or feel or talk or write this type of way anymore, and that's okay, just to show how much we've progressed as humans as a society. You know, that's how I view it. So it falls into that. So I think that conversation, especially because that conversation's come up more and more about, you know, going back and re-editing not only books but also movies. So that's been a conversation. So it felt kind of like, especially in that thing, because a lot of movies people kind of, I won't say, I hate using the word canceled. That's a whole other conversation. But the whole thing of like, right, you view older movies through the lens of present day, which isn't fair, you know, because once again, every movie is a time capsule of when it was written and how it was written and what was said and what was done, because it was, you know, it was fine then, might not be socially acceptable now, and that's, you know, perfectly fine. Either way, I may have read too much into it, but that's what I felt like that bit was supposed to represent. It is interesting how much you already kind of got this feeling about him that Ben was a dick, but this episode, especially hearing from Dickie, really showcased how much of a dick he was. That apparently he set all his watches like 20 minutes late just so that he could be 20 minutes, like so he could be fashionably late. It was like he did that 100% on purpose because I guess he felt like that was the big star thing to do. He was kind of a dick to everyone. Could we find out that Dickie's actually adopted because his parents didn't know that whether or not they'd ever be able to have kids, and eventually had Ben, who was like the miracle kid. He was a success and everything, which obviously rubs Dickie the wrong way because like I'm the older one, but I always had to sacrifice so much to protect my brother. I did so much for him, yet he's the one that got all the credit. You could tell like it was rubbing him the wrong way, especially because, and you can infer, like, now having the knowledge, it makes a lot of sense of, like, why, like, you know, but it's still that thing of, it was my brother and I loved him and he's gone now. He's like, and I love that line from him where it's like, basically it's not till people are gone that you realize, like, people are just made up of 1,000 different things. And he's just like, right, that my brother liked the boba green tea, even though it was god-awful, like, he loved it, and this and that. It's just like, it's the little things about people that you miss the most when they're gone. You know, and I love how that kind of ties in with Uma's story of, like, you know, especially directly because she ended up selling the handkerchief she took from Ben, you know, made a lot of money off of it. The person who bought it was Dickie. I mean, she has no, like, connection to any of this, so why would she recognize Dickie as Ben's brother? He's always been in the background. She doesn't pay enough attention to that type of stuff because she made it seem like it was just some snake bro weirdo that bought it, but it's like, no, it was, well, not unless it was someone that bought it specifically for Dickie. Like, maybe Dickie didn't directly buy it. Maybe he got someone to buy it for him from her. I don't know. Because she probably saw this as an opportunity because it was something of Ben's and all that Snake Bro, CoBro stuff was being sold. So she was like, oh, this is a opportunity for me, and probably went there specifically. Like I said, maybe she didn't recognize Dickie as his brother, thought like, oh, this is just some dude selling memorabilia because he's a CoBro weirdo. Like I said, we don't know. But all we know is the end result is Dickie has it. He's not the killer. He has the motive for it. But I think he kept it because despite his issues with his brother, it's still his brother. And yes, his brother stole his ideas because we find out he's actually the one that came with the CoBro concept. But it doesn't make that cut any less. I think it's still the thing of your bro being dead doesn't like change the fact that, I mean, you probably wish that things were different between you now that he's gone, and I think that handkerchief, it's like, it's the last thing he has to hold on to Ben. I think that's what really kind of resonates with him because it's got Ben's blood on and stuff. It's like I get this last thing that's connected to my brother. Like, this was the last thing that was in his possession. So it's like being able to hold on to his bro. So just like Uma holds on to stuff, that's why he did. It wasn't to get rid of evidence. It's like it's the last thing that's tied to his brother that he's able to hold on to, which is ironic considering like all the memorabilia and stuff he's selling. But I think that's kind of the point of, I get to sell all this. This will be mine. The one thing I get to keep of my brother. But kind of going back to focusing on the Mabel of it all, her hanging out with Tauber and him kind of helping her try to rebrand the podcast, where it's like oh, hey, here's this new poster, the Bloody Mabel podcast. And he's like, I was thinking this, make you the focus. She's like, God, no. He's like, yeah, of course, it's terrible. Yeah, it must have been like fan submitted or something. It's like, poor guy. He probably put a lot of time and effort into it for her to kind of not like it, so. But that also ties into like what I was going to bring up before about like, is that going to be a love triangle? But like I said, I don't know if Theo views Mabel that way, but it was almost like this awkward thing where like Theo and Taubert meet and it's just kind of like, huh. Because it was interesting because Taubert's trying to figure Mabel out because it's like, oh, do you want to record the podcast? Like, what were Oliver's settings? Oh, don't worry about it. I'll figure it out. But Mabel's kind of hesitant to film the podcast with. That's what I thought immediately when I saw her there at the murder board with Theo on one side and Taubert. It's like, oh, she's got her replacements, because at that time she didn't have Oliver or Charles, so it's kind of like, no, I don't need them right now because I'm going full steam ahead. Maybe if they had apologized sooner, maybe we wouldn't gotten the end result we got. We'll get to that in a second about the teaser and everything, but I wonder, did she actually full-blown sign the deal with Cindy? So I'm so curious. Had she already struck a deal with her, but probably not. She probably took the idea of like what Cinda was like, oh, go off on your own, and she's just doing it and just not working with Cinda because it's like, I'm not going to work with you, Cinda, because, we have our history, Which I even love that, obviously, when they brought up the comic thing, the first comic of the CoBro situation, and it's like, oh, the only thing they had to go by is this isn't a B as in Ben Glenroy, it's an R for Richard, which was short for, what's Dick short for? Richard. So it's like, oh, is that really all the evidence we have to go by? Which I love. That's like, Mabel's like, we accuse Sting of being a murderer because he doesn't like dogs. I'm like, I remember that. It's like, yeah, so this is actually way more evidence in comparison. So, but yeah, when the time came to record the podcast and she was hesitant, Theo had that, he wrote to Taubert, like, yeah, I can't figure her out either. And so she was staring at the phone, looking at Charles and Oliver, but it's just like, right, I'll do this on my own. Because I was wondering if they were, I guess they're like her crew in the same regard, but Taubert's just recording it. He's not, an active member of it, which I did like because Taubert is a fan of the podcast. He was familiar with Theo, so it's almost weird, like, oh, I'm meeting someone that I'm kind of I know you through the podcast. It's almost like it's weirdly that almost fourth wall breaking thing of almost like, oh, you're almost like a fictional person, even though you're based on a real person because I know you through a podcast, but I'm meeting like the real you, so that's kind of weird. So I mean, just kind of like the same thing where Mabel, but it's different because like Mabel's like a main character and now you're also dating. So there's a little bit of that. But yeah, we get the development at the end that Mabel has recorded the podcast and even says that this season it's a solo podcast. She put out a teaser, which we don't know how many episodes she recorded or whether the teaser's all that she's recorded. She's probably prepping everything for her future recordings, which I finally got the answer I wanted because I was like, because they hadn't tackled the podcast angle to it yet. I mean, even last episode, Charles was like, "Oh, are you recording with him?" Like, but none of them they had recorded bits and pieces, but nothing had been put together for the sake of the podcast yet. So I don't know how much maybe she's recorded bits for it, but they haven't, like, bits and pieces of it, but nothing has been, like, maybe there haven't been full-blown episodes, so maybe the majority of the early podcasts will be simply solo Mabel episodes, but then later on, they'll be, like, the more traditional Only Murders in the Building crew. But like I said, they have not really brought up the podcast recording. At least the first season, it was a pretty big part of the story, but like it wasn't as big in my recollection in the second season. But like I said, we did get like the fans' perspective on it, in which we still haven't gotten at this episode. But I guess to some extent we did because we got all the different people listening to it. Which includes the new detective who got a call, which I'm assuming it's from Detective Williams. And he's like, yeah, they are kind of thorn in the side, but we do have to open this case back up. Because I had skipped over an important piece of evidence was because they thought Gary was the killer because he was found in the building, leaving the building around the same time of Ben's death. But Ben's death is actually earlier because his watch is set 20 minutes late. So by the time Home Dude had left, they were basing that purely on when Ben's watch had died. And that's kind of an interesting thing about a murder. Like, I wonder, did the person who murdered him think that far ahead? Did they know that about Ben? Because not everyone knew that. That seems like something Dickie would know, but not everyone else. So either the killer could have done that on purpose to make it so like, oh, I know this thing about Ben and I could utilize it to hide the time of the murder, or it just happened to be happenstance and it worked out for their favor that Ben had this quirk about, trying to be fashionably late. And because of that, the killer just benefited from it in that regard. So it just solidified it more that it was Gary, even though it wasn't. So it has gotten the case open back up now, though. So they're kind of a nuisance, like a very Scooby-Doo gang-esque meddling kids type, meddling people, I should say, situation. But I mean, it works out from time to time with their approach. But because Mabel did make that decision before Oliver and Charles were able to apologize to her to bring her a clue, I'm curious to see what that means going forward, because once again, she made that decision like, I'm going to do this with or without you guys. I was hoping to do it with you, but since they didn't really reach out to me, and the only person who did was Oliver, because he was like, oh, I called her. Charles was like, really, you did? He's like, no, of course I did. He's like, I drafted this very long text, but then like I deleted most of it and ended up accidentally sending her only a comma. Haven't heard back yet, so it's going to be interesting to see what that means for their dynamic. And I mean, especially now that she's recording the podcast without them and kind of put it out there already. Like maybe for her, it's like, right, I need to jump on this immediately so we could get Gary released so we could get the case opened back up and begin all this. So it's a necessary thing, but maybe she doesn't realize how much it's going to really affect Charles and Oliver that she did this, because it's been their thing for so long, and now she's kind of going off on her own. And so, I don't know. Once again, I'm so interested. I really hope we do get the fan perspective on it, because we've been missing that this episode. So, like I said, we kind of got it this episode with all the different people that are listening, but Only Murders in the Building, # Bloody Mabel. And potentially get their reactions to the podcast being what it is, and maybe that in itself could end up funny enough, like dividing the fan base type of situation. It'd be interesting if we get like an insight and stuff like that. But regardless of it, I'm interested to see where the next episode takes us going forward with all of this. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.